Start recording. So hello everybody, today is Tuesday the 18th of April 2023. We have Lee Kant, Anthony Stansfield to look at the position of banking frauds. Anthony did a statement in 19th of January 2018 regarding the HBOS excuse me, Reading case. And Anthony was the crime commissioner for Thames Valley Police. He spent £7 million on the CPS prosecution of the HBOS, and since then they've carried on, and the victims are still waiting their compensation. So over to you, Anthony.
Well, as you said, I was the police commissioner for the Thames Valley for nearly 9 years, and for part of that time I led on fraud nationally for PCCs. It was my police force, Thames Valley, that did the only major prosecution of a very large banking fraud. 2 other police forces had turned it down, as had the SFO, leaving literally hundreds of victims, I believe. In penury, people had committed suicide, people had died of cancer while this was going on. If they got nothing back, people would dispossess their homes. This particular one was focused on Reading. It was we prosecuted on 245 million. The fraud was actually more, approaching £1 billion. There's not much point prosecuting too large a fraud, because it just takes more time in court and the jury find it more difficult to understand it. But it was the only successful prosecution. The defendants got a combined, I think, 49 years in prison. Some of them are out. I think one is still in prison. Throughout the trial, Lloyds, the bank that actually owned HBOS, denied a fraud had taken place throughout the trial. It's partly why the trial took us so long and cost us £7 million to bring the case, which is far more than most police forces can afford to bring a case. We eventually, when we got the guilty verdicts after a long court case, it was only then that Lloyds would admit that a fraud had taken place. It was a very, a difficult case to prosecute because they're always complicated. We did eventually get compensation for a great number of people, but they fought tooth and nail. And there was actually an internal report written in Lloyds about all of this called the Sally Masterton Turnbull Report. It was commissioned by the bank for her to write it. She was a senior accountant. When she'd finished it, she was promptly sacked. And they said that she was a bit doolally. It hadn't been authorised, and not only that, but it was totally unsubstantiated. All of that was a straight lie. She certainly was very on the ball. She was a very clever accountant. It was totally substantiated, and she'd certainly been authorised to write it. I had the emails between her and their head of audit and risk at the time discussing it. Since she was sacked without proper compensation, it took myself and Lord Hollick to actually have a major meeting with Lord Blackwell, who was the chairman of Lloyds, and say this is unacceptable behaviour, and eventually got her compensation. But the whole behaviour of the bank throughout was absolutely disastrous. But what was clear is that what was going on had gone on out of HBOS in Reading was also going on in a wide scale out of Lloyds and RBS. And it seemed to be a sort of technique that they used. I won't go into the various techniques, there's more than one. But there were certain centres of it. One was Bristol, one was Gresham Street, a go-go bank in Scotland, and the sums of money are absolutely vast. They run into many billion. And actually, nothing has been done to investigate it. There's been a massive cover-up by our regulatory authorities. The PRA should have got a grip of it. The SFO should have got a grip of it. The Financial Conduct Authority should have got a grip of it, and the National Crime Agency should have got a grip of it. It's by far the biggest financial crimes ever in this country, and nothing has been done about it properly to this day. I'll stop there. You've got my paper on this.
Okay. Sorry. I've got technical issues now coming back to where... Oh, okay. Got you. Right, so I'm back with you. Yeah, I was just going down your statement, and that's exactly what you've written down in your statement of 2018. So what could you add to your statement now that you've witnessed other things up till now, 2023, that has anything improved? Is it slowing down? Is it carrying on? What effect has your input had on their behaviour, the criminal behaviour?
Well, there have been, I think, 4 or 5 House of Commons debates on this. And every time a large number of MPs say this is utterly disgraceful, what has been going on, the minister, usually John Glenn, he's been in and out of the job as senior Treasury Minister, gets up and gives the government reply and says these are very serious allegations, something must be done about it, and precisely nothing is done whatsoever about it. And the trouble is there's far too much of an in and out of employment between Parliament, the banks, and the regulatory authorities, and they all guard each other's backs. They said several MPs have tried fairly hard.
And can you see that this has got a light at the end of the tunnel for us?
Well, I can't go into it in detail. There are 1 or 2 things that are happening that I hope will bring it to a head. But it shouldn't be me and others like me trying to do this. It should be the government doing it. Or actually, it's not so much the government, it's the civil service who should be doing something about it, and the regulatory authorities. They know perfectly well what has gone on, and it's their job to do it. But if you get the Financial Conduct Authority basically covering up, Financial Conduct Authority had the Sally Masterton report for 3 years and hid it and allowed her to be sacked without proper compensation and did nothing to support her. And their attitude throughout this, and what I find particularly depressing, is that their director, Andrew Bailey, went straight from that job to run the Bank of England, which I find quite extraordinary.
So now with my particular case, are you able to speak about?
It's very difficult for me to, nearly to get into individual cases because there are literally thousands. I can't keep on top of it.
Okay.
But this business of manufacturing a bankruptcy when one doesn't actually exist, usually on a totally non-existent debt in most cases, even if a debt exists, the amount they recover is vastly more than the debt ever was in the first place. And that seems to be, in your case, that a very small manufactured debt has been used to take off property and over huge sums of money off you when there isn't a proper debt. I can't remember the original debt that they claimed was something like 25,000. Well, how can they then take off from you your house and things like this? I find it extraordinary.
Coming back to the way of the compensation for the victims, so they haven't had their compensation. So normally, if somebody's found fraudulently trading, they are dissolved. So surely that the banks need to be dissolved.
Well, I think it's rather difficult because it's our biggest clearing banks in the country. Lloyds and RBS, you can't bring the bank down on this. I think we would all lose out hugely and nationally. But I think the bank should be made to pay out to the victims that it has created. And I think those that were in charge of this should be held responsible and should be criminally charged, because there's a great effort certainly by the Crown Prosecution Service and the police to say these are civil matters.
Yeah.
They're not civil matters. They're criminal matters when people have been deliberately defrauded. And there isn't a statute of limitations on the time you can bring these cases, which is another excuse that is used. So they should be criminally charged and brought up. I mean, the only case besides major one, besides your HBOS case, was one that came up just before Christmas last year, so only 4 or 5 months ago. And it had to be prosecuted privately because the Crown Prosecution Service and the Met Police wouldn't take the case on. And the judge said he found it extraordinary that such a clear case of criminal fraud was not prosecuted by the authorities. But very few people who have been totally defrauded and made insolvent have got the money to do a private criminal prosecution. In this case, I think it was about £12 million had been defrauded, but it was an overseas company and they had the money to put up to have it privately prosecuted. But that shouldn't be people's jobs. And said most people don't have the money to do that.
Are you able to mention the case? The bank involved?
I'm going to have difficulty remembering exactly. So the man who went to jail was Stephen David Jones.
Oh, right, yes.
And he got a considerable sentence. I mean, he was an accountant who was doing the fraud. I don't think the bank was put in court in any form or shape whatsoever. So I won't go into which banks were involved, but banks certainly colluded in it and made money, I'm sure.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Lee, do you have any questions for Anthony?
Yes, it's to going back to 2007, when at the beginning of when we were all discovering these frauds were occurring, what were the major obstacles that prevented justice from being done, and why did it take so long? And the government should have had the initiative to act quickly and effectively, and of course they failed in their duty to the electorate. And so why should people bother to even vote for these people if people are being constantly let down every day? And
Lee, I think Anthony's got the question, so
yeah. I think it started under Blair and Brown as Chancellor and carried on when Brown was Prime Minister. And it was then ably carried on, I'm afraid, by the Conservative government after the Labour government had allowed it to start. I can understand that there was a desire when all the banks were in a very rocky state at that stage not to rock the boat with the banks. But they also have a responsibility, if the banks are committing deliberate fraud, to protect the victims, and they totally fail to do so. And that goes to both major political parties. And I have to say also, when we had a coalition, the person responsible was a very senior Liberal cabinet minister. And he again said all the right things and did absolutely precisely nothing. So this isn't that, a party political business particularly. It's just a whole lot of politicians not doing their jobs properly.
I'm just finishing off showing the your statement, Anthony, and I'm just going to go into the FCA. I don't know if you want to comment on this actual report. What was missing from it, according to yourself?
Well, I find the most extraordinary thing about the FCA fining Lloyds Bank 45 million was actually the original fine was 65 million, but they then said, oh, because Lloyds had cooperated so well with them, it would be reduced to 45 million. Well, I can assure you they didn't cooperate properly with the police. They said they were not guilty throughout the big HBOS trial, and made the prosecution much more difficult. When we tried to get information out of the bank, they either didn't provide it, or would then send lorry loads with the information that you actually required buried in it. I can't remember how many people we had working on this, 40 or 50 people just going through their paperwork, which they could easily sort it out themselves if they'd been cooperative. So no, the FCA then really let them off. If this had happened in America or Australia, the bank would have been fined vastly more money than that. It should have had 1, if not 2 noughts on it. I mean, it was the most disgraceful episode of the FCA covering up and then letting them off with it. And 45 million to a big bank like Lloyds is absolute petty cash.
And then, Anthony, could you comment on this? I keep using this a lot. The EWCA CRIM 369. Can you just give an overview of what happened here?
This is the main HBOS case, is it?
It was when they tried to reduce their.
Well, I mean, one of the major problems, I think we didn't prosecute half the people we should have prosecuted, but they were let off without prosecution. And of course, the bank was able to keep this at a local level where it should have been, it should have gone right up to the top. This, I mean, main board members should have been resigning over this. Not one person took responsibility for what went on, other than the middle seniority bankers who we put in jail, who were the sort of the sharp end of this. But he went much deeper than these people.
Well, what do you think about this reporting restriction here?
I mean, I have to say that, I'm not an expert on the reasons for this. This particular case, before Lord Justice Irwin and those three, I mean, I don't really know enough about it. I do know the judge in the HBOS trial case actually was extremely good, but you've got to get it into a criminal court. If it just goes through civil courts, you will lose it every single time. And what I find extraordinary is far too many of the judges involved in the civil cases are part-time judges who very often work for most of the year for the very people who should be prosecuted.
Yeah.
I mean, to put it mildly, some of the civil courts and the way the judges have behaved absolutely stinks.
But the bank has bribed them, obviously. You know, we've got proof that the judges have been bribed by the bank because they're money laundering, they're fraudulently trading, and they're carrying on with their crimes and their criminal cover-ups to this day, as I know from firsthand from my late sister's murder by the bank.
I think, any evidence you've got of that would be really useful, and not on this message, but I will tell you who to coordinate that with.
Right, okay. So I guess putting the banks on notice that we have got a plan, that we know how this is going to go forwards. The bank need to fully cooperate with us, and all the regulators, the financial and legal. What about the solicitors and the barristers who are bribed as well?
Yes, I mean, the biggest income for some of the big legal companies in London is clearly Lloyds Bank and RBS. And also one of the difficulties, I think, that this should really be across the press. But when you look at the media generally, but when you look at the amount of advertising that the banks do, the millions, the tens of millions they spend on advertising in our major broadsheet newspapers, you can understand why the editors and the proprietors are not keen that these really hard stories should be published. And it's not the journalists' fault. They would like to publish a lot of this, but I think they are totally constrained by their editors and their ownerships.
I think we have got good people in every field, but they are scared of what the banks might do to them because what the banks are running the criminal networks, and they're scared for their lives. I guess they're under duress, and they got their bills to pay and their children to feed. So I'm guessing that the tipping balance will be soon. That, with your work, Anthony, amazing courage and dedication to humanity, that the tipping balance is going to be very, very soon. What do you think?
Well, I hope so. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm very cautious about being optimistic about this. And what I found extraordinary is the direct links between the very hard end of serious organized crime and bankers. And that is quite evident in some cases.
Yeah, so like my false arrest, 2 false arrests from the property by the police without a writ of the High Court, without a warrant, or when they knew these bailiffs had come from the county court, and Michael Moore as well, that the police do have the resources to do false arrests of whistleblowers, but they don't have the resources to prosecute banks because they're busy prosecuting whistleblowers. That's the problem, I think.
Well, I think the problem with the police is that they simply don't understand fraud. And it's so easy. Fraud is complicated. Fraud requires knowledge and detail, and you're up against serious legal practices. So the police are very worried about taking it on. So some junior constable or sergeant is sent along to investigate a multi-million-pound case. And it's all too difficult, and it's shuffled under the thing. I mean, it was extraordinary, the HBOS case, that it was, as I said, a massive fraud approaching £1 billion. 2 police forces had turned it down, as has the SFO. There was no shortage of evidence. And that recent case, a fraud of 12 million, the judge said it was absolutely clear, but the police hadn't taken it on. So the police, I think it's basically incompetence, lack of knowledge, and lack of money. I don't think in most cases, in most police forces, there is direct corruption, but I think in some police forces, and there is corruption. And I think there is corruption within the City of London Police, within the Met. and probably within Avon and Somerset police over major cases. The collusion between the very senior police officers and the banks has been quite extraordinary. The passing of documents between them, which simply shouldn't have been allowed, it's illegal, has gone on. And I won't go into detail about that, but again, it does stink sometimes.
Yeah, Lee, do you want to ask any final questions? Because I've got about 3 minutes left on I don't know how, I've only got 3 minutes left on this recording.
Would it be worth writing a second statement, Anthony?
Well, I have 3 other documents I've written, which I can send you, and I will send them to you. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, excellent. So anything else you want to add, Anthony, about the other stuff that's going on in the background? That would be great.
Well, I said there are, I don't want to go into it. 1 or 2 things are happening. And I don't know whether they'll be successful or not. But it shouldn't be people like me with no authority whatsoever that is trying to get this sorted out. It should be the government. It should be the government ministers in the Treasury should be doing it. People like John Glenn should be sorting it out, not covering it up. It should be the director of the FCA who should be sorting it out. It should be the director of the Bank of England, who has covered it up personally for the last... I had interviews with Andrew Bailey about this. I have all the correspondence with him. He knew perfectly well what was going on and did nothing. And they are the people who should be sorting it out, not me.
But you do have authority, Anthony. You are the witness. You are a qualified witness, an expert witness to the frauds going back to 2007. And your witness evidence isn't going to be outdated. It's still in date. So if anyone can take this forward, it's your evidence that needs to be taken on the table, corrected, backwards, forwards, and everyone compensated. That's mandatory, surely.
Well, yes, I mean, I have not been defrauded, so I have no personal evidence. This is all other people's cases. And I'm not an accountant and I'm not a lawyer. I was a businessman. But I know fraud when I see it, as should everybody. It's pretty bloody clear. And, you know, this has gone on for too long and it has not been dealt with. And it is basically a cover-up on the behalf of some very crooked bankers that go back. I mean, you can't say it's the Board of Lloyds today. This is the Board of Lloyds 1 lot back, 2 lots back. It goes back a long time, and the board members have sat on this and hidden it. And, you know, they go on, they sit on government bodies, or they come from government bodies and sit on the boards of the banks.
I'm really sorry to cut you short there. My recording is going to stop, so I'm going to end it now. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony and Lee. I'm going to end it now, sorry, because I don't want to lose the recording just in case.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.